Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about the research on and the role of peanuts in the risk reduction of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. My guest today is Dr. Samara Sterling. She is a nutrition scientist and the research director for the Peanut Institute. She has expertise in the use of plant-based nutrition for the prevention and treatment of chronic diseases. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sterling.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And I want my listeners to know that this episode is sponsored by the family farmers of the Georgia Peanut Commission, and we thank them for their sponsorship and support of the podcast. Now, Samara, before we start talking about peanuts and research and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, I would really love to hear more about your background and how you got into nutrition science.
Sure. And I'll say that in terms of my background, I think I've had a pretty unique path because I've always been interested in nutrition and foods from a very young age. My family tells me that I was quite fascinated with food. So I'm from an island culture, and within the tropics, there are a lot of these cooking shows like we have here, Rachel Ray and all these cooking shows. And when I was about 3 or 4 years old, my parents tell me that I would watch these shows and I would try to imitate, not just, with a spatula or with a spoon, and not just trying to imitate that, but really putting on my entire production of food and nutrition and teaching people, even at that young age. And so I kind of like to think that that's where my start came from. Fast forward some years as I went through school, I initially was very much drawn to biology and the sciences. And I initially sort of wanted to take that into med school. That's sort of what I thought about at the time. And then there was a turning point where my father was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. And one of the things that his primary care physician told us was that, we needed to kind of start watching what he ate. And that was actually the first time that I had heard this concept of food having anything to do with chronic disease, believe it or not. I mean, I was in college at the time, but the idea that food had something to do with what my dad was experiencing at the time, this was so novel to me. And I decided that I wanted to start looking for information. And I started where any college student would start, Google. And I decided that I was going to find all the information that I could. One of the things that happened when I looked to Google was obviously there was so much information out there. Much of that information was good, but then I realized that some of that information was also contradicting other information that I was getting. So I started to get confused and wonder, well, how do I know exactly what to believe? And how can I empower myself to learn concepts and understand what's really going on within the human body as it relates to food, so that I could empower myself as well as my family and surrounding community to make better health decisions. And that was really where I decided that I wanted to go back to school, got my master's in nutrition and wellness with an emphasis in plant-based nutrition. And then I did my doctoral work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I delved a little bit deeper into that, studied nutrition there as well. And then from there, I moved to the Peanut Institute, where now I serve as the research director for nutrition research here.
Fascinating. I can just see you as a little toddler, playing with food and trying to teach people. That's adorable. And a very interesting path indeed to where you are today. Tell us a little bit more about your role as the research director for the Peanut Institute.
Sure. So the Peanut Institute is a nonprofit organization, and we're based in Albany, Georgia. And our organization supports nutrition research, and we develop educational programs that encourage the healthful lifestyles that include peanuts and peanut products. And one of the reasons that the Peanut Institute was formed was sort of out of this low-fat craze that happened in the 1990s. And when we think about where that craze even came from, I may talk about that a little bit later, but it really kind of started in the 1940s and then just kind of built up through the 1990s where, folks were saying all fat is bad. And so peanuts were considered to be fat in a shell because, it's high in fat. And it wasn't until research started to come out of Loma Linda University that showed that, hey, wait a minute, the fat in peanuts might actually be really good for cardiovascular disease. That research, as well as others, were really what kind of birthed the Peanut Institute. And that was where we started to do more and more research. And since then, we've branched out into other areas of nutrition in looking at how peanut consumption affects health. So right now, there are research projects ongoing in the areas of fitness, gut microbiome, weight management, as well as cognition. And then there's also interest sort of in the health and wellness space. So for folks who say, well, I don't necessarily have a chronic disease, how do I actually just kind of stay healthy? We're also looking at research in that area as well. So it's been exciting just to see the growth that we've had over the last few years and over the last few decades, and being able to identify some of that powerful research that we're continuing to discover.
Yes, and my regular listeners know I've done about 3 other episodes related to peanuts, but they were all related to allergies. And it was with Sherry Coleman Collins, the Peanut RD. And I'll put links in my show notes to these episodes, but the most recent one was episode 174 about infant feeding and food allergies. And then there's one back, episode 91, about food allergies in school, which I learned so much about how food allergies are handled at school, and maybe some suggestions for how to improve upon that. And then way back in episode 68, talking about peanut allergy prevention. So I'm really excited to not focus on allergies with you today, unless there's any news in that arena that you want to share with us. But I'm really interested in learning more about what makes peanuts and peanut products and that plant-based nutrition so healthy. And we're going to dive into diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but I know that there's other things that we're going to touch on as well. Where should we start? Maybe with the research about the diabetes and cardiovascular disease. What are you seeing in the current research about this?
Well, that is a loaded question because there's a lot that we are currently seeing. But I guess where I'll start is, for those who don't know, and my colleague Sherry may have talked a little bit about this, right? But peanuts are unique in that botanically they are considered a legume, but nutritionally they're classified as nuts. And so it's this really interesting hybrid that you see nutritionally because you see the protein content of peanuts being sort of similar to legumes. So in fact, peanuts have more protein than any other nut. And then you'll see the fat profile as similar to other nuts. And this is where the heart health comes in. So as I mentioned before, the 1990s study from Loma Linda University, there's been more and more research that's sort of been coming out since then. And a lot of it is population studies, epidemiological data that really kind of follows people over time. One of those is from Harvard University, the Nurses' Health Study, as well as the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And that study followed folks for over 20 years. And just recently in 2019, there was a study released from that data that showed that folks who consumed peanuts and peanut butter regularly, that was associated with a significantly reduced risk of cardiovascular disease over time. And what was unique for this study was that they actually separated the data into 4-year intervals to see, well, okay, what if I regularly consume peanuts within this interval, and then maybe I stop at a point in time. But what they found is that there seems to be this cumulative effect. So regularly consuming it and doing that consistently over time is what really contributes to the benefits that we see for cardiovascular disease. And our listeners may be wondering, well, what's the mechanism behind that? Why do we see something like that? And I mentioned the protein. And the reason I mentioned the protein is because proteins are made up from amino acids. And one of the amino acids in peanuts is called arginine. This is a very well-known vasodilator. So in other words, it's a precursor to nitric oxide, which is well known to dilate our blood vessels and improve endothelial function. So the way that our blood vessels function, being able to move blood freely through those blood vessels to and from the heart. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing that. So there was a study a few years ago from Penn State that showed that a high-fat meal that included peanuts and peanut butter, after the participants consumed that meal, they had increased endothelial function. So that's one of the reasons that we see that, mainly because of the arginine, as well as the healthy fats that we talked about, the unsaturated fats that the American Heart Association says is really good for cardiovascular disease. These are really two of the powerhouses that we see in peanuts and peanut butter.
I was not aware of the amino acid arginine being a vasodilator, or if I learned it in chemistry, I forgot. And obviously anything that, when we talk about cardiovascular disease and diabetes, there's a big overlap there because people with diabetes are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease, mostly type 2. However, there's some correlation with type 1 as well. And I guess that begs the question with the research that we're going to be talking about with regard to diabetes. Was it primarily focused on type 2 or type 1 as well?
And that's a good question. Yeah, most of the research is really focused on type 2 diabetes. And the reason for that is because type 2 diabetes is considered to be largely preventable because in many cases, it's lifestyle factors that are the main contributors to developing it. And of course, like you said, we do have some emerging research with type 1 diabetes, but I will say there's not much research there in terms of peanuts and peanut butter. There's a lot of focus more so on type 2 diabetes. Mm-hmm. So in terms of type 2 diabetes, really it's when we look at the lifestyle medicine angle that we start to see that consuming peanuts and peanut butter can really help with some of the modifiable risk factors that we see in diabetes, such as overweight and obesity, as well as when you're talking about cardiovascular disease and the overlap that's there, you see that correlation. So what some of our listeners may or may not know is that both peanuts and peanut butter play a key role in helping to prevent type 2 diabetes. And I think these are really the two areas to talk about: prevention as well as management. So if I don't have diabetes, what can I do to help prevent it? And if I do have type 2 diabetes, what are some of the things that can help keep my blood glucose levels under control? Mm-hmm. So again, I talked about the Nurses' Health Study from Harvard, and there was a study there done in 2002, and it was published in a very high impact journal, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And that study showed that peanut butter consumption was associated with a 21% lower risk of type 2 diabetes in women who consumed it 5 times a week or more. And even the whole peanuts themselves, that was also associated with reduced risk. Now, fast forward 14 years or so when that study was released in 2002, 14 years later, they went back and they looked at the data, and the researchers said, okay, what if we combined a few different cohorts? So the Nurses' Health Study, health professionals follow-up study that included both men and women, over 200,000 men and women. And the main question was, okay, what if we actually substitute various sources of protein, so animal proteins for plant proteins, and look at the differences there? And this was in 2016. And what they showed was that substituting just 5% of daily calories from animal protein with a plant protein source like peanuts or peanut butter was associated with a 23% reduction for type 2 diabetes. And that research has continued, where we see a meta-analysis in 2020 still continuing to show that inverse relationship there for peanut and tree nut consumption for the development of diabetes. And I think that research is pretty strong. The main area I will say that we're continuing to look a little bit more into is really the management side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So their benefits, I talked about the epidemiological study, the population data. That's where we get the prevention data. But when we want to look at management, a lot of times we're looking at the randomized control trials or the feeding studies. This is where you are literally controlling, so to speak, having that influence over a person's diet so that you can actually see what the outcomes are and relate that to the intervention that you've done. And there was a study of randomized control trials from Penn State University, and that was published in 2019. And basically what they did was they actually looked at a total of 40 studies in close to 3,000 participants, and they assessed how consuming peanuts affect glycemic control. And what they found was that consuming peanuts significantly decreased both insulin resistance and fasting insulin needs. And that suggested that peanut consumption could even improve insulin sensitivity, which is something that we don't necessarily traditionally think of. I know for many public health programs, when it comes on to managing type 2 diabetes, it's really just about, okay, well, let's just try to keep your levels stable, like your blood sugar levels stable, and not necessarily increase your insulin needs if you are on insulin, but to actually see a reversion of that, so to speak, that's something that's quite significant. And I'll mention one more study from the University of Incarnate Word in Texas, and that one was published in 2018. And what they did was they said, well, what if we use peanut butter and we give our participants peanut butter with a high glycemic breakfast? So I think they used white bread and orange juice and paired that with peanut butter. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily recommend, refined grains for breakfast all the time. But what they did was that they paired it that way. And then they tested blood sugar levels after 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and 120 minutes. And this particular study found that when peanut butter was added to that high glycemic meal, the spike in blood glucose was significantly lower than without the peanut butter, up to 60 minutes post-meal. And this actually coincided with an earlier study from Purdue University that showed that effect up to 8 hours after consumption. And so that's really significant to see that just a small change by including peanuts or peanut butter within your meal, that can help to control blood sugar levels if you are a type 2 diabetic. And if you're not, it might actually help with prevention as well.
It's really exciting to hear that it was simply added, because a lot of times we see the randomized control trials where they're swapping out, which makes sense, but to have that just added to the high glycemic breakfast and seeing those results, very exciting. And it makes sense because, as you said, peanuts have protein and healthy unsaturated fats, and that does help the body absorb the calories and the carbohydrate in a more slow fashion. So that's very interesting.
Right.
And you mentioned the epidemiology studies, the population studies, and most of my listeners know, but I'll just reinforce this, that, those types of studies are correlation and association versus a randomized control trial, which can really look at causation, cause and effect.
Right.
As we're talking about peanut research, and I'm so glad you threw in the peanut butter too, because my guess is that that's probably the most common way that people consume peanuts. And we love our peanut butter, right? You mentioned the protein. We talked a little bit about the healthy unsaturated fats. I would like to hear more about that. But there are other components in peanut products that I'd love for you to touch on. I know that there's some plant sterols, some bioactives. You were maybe getting around to talking about inflammation with regard to the cardiovascular disease. So I'd love for you to touch on those.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned the plant sterols. That's a really key point, as well as the unsaturated fats. And the reason that we see peanut butter emerging as such a superstar for diabetes, so to speak, in clinical settings, is because it has a lot to do with the digestion. For example, we know that when we eat peanuts, a lot of that calories that we eat from peanuts are not necessarily absorbed into the body. Up to 18% is actually excreted. And one of the reasons for that is we don't necessarily chew it as well, so some of those calories are lost. But with peanut butter, you see that a lot of the fat is released. A lot more of that fat is released. And so that helps to slow digestion. So it improves satiety, as well as slowing the spike of glucose, which is probably why we see the results that we did from that study that I mentioned. But beyond that, peanuts are also a high fiber food, and that also contributes to weight loss and helps insulin to be more effective. And so in this way, you have less insulin being needed to control blood sugar. And then our listeners may not know this, but peanuts are also a low carb food with a glycemic index of 14. So that also means that it helps your blood sugar from going out of control. And then, like I mentioned before, one of the secondary benefits that helps with insulin resistance is with weight control, because we know that 50% of type 2 diabetes can be prevented by keeping our BMIs below 25. And so there was another study in 2020 that showed that peanut consumption can actually help with long-term weight management. I'm always careful when I say that, because it doesn't necessarily mean that peanuts will help you lose weight. Now, we do see that in weight loss trials. If you include peanuts and peanut butter in weight loss trials, there's some benefit there. But peanuts and peanut butter by themselves, we wouldn't necessarily say that they're weight loss foods, but it can help maintain your weight because of that caloric loss that I talked about before. And so in the long term, it can help to prevent long-term obesity. And fun fact, we tend to gain about a pound a year if we don't do anything about it. It's just something that kind of creeps up on us as we get older. And so just a small change, if you think about 20 years, you've gained 20 pounds that you didn't intend to gain. Just including that small change can actually help to protect against that.
Yes, and it makes sense too, because with the fiber, the protein, and the healthy fats, that all provides satiety. It helps us feel fuller longer. And I'm guessing, whether the research showed that or not specifically, that could be a factor in play there too.
Right, definitely.
So we talked a little bit about the fiber, but when we think about peanut butter, then sometimes I think people think, oh, that's high in sugar. What can you tell us about specifically peanut butter and the nutritional composition regarding sugar and the fat content? I think sometimes peanut butter may have some other types of fat added to it that aren't originally in the peanut. Can you enlighten us a little bit on peanut butter?
Sure. And that's a good question. So peanut butter can be different depending on where in the world you go. So I'll talk about U.S. peanut butter. So in the United States, there's a standard of identity for peanut butter. And that basically means that by law, peanut butter has to be at least 90% peanuts. If you see, for example, a peanut spread or some other name, there might be less amount of peanuts there, but the actual term peanut butter, that means that whatever you're eating has to be at least 90% peanuts. So when we talk about the quantities of other ingredients that may be in there, it's small compared to the amount of peanuts that are there. With that being said, this is where I think personal choice really comes in. So some manufacturers may add a little bit of sugar. Typically, we'll see maybe less than 1 gram of sugar to up to 2 grams of sugar. Don't usually see much more than that. And then some manufacturers may also include a small amount of stabilizer. There's also a misconception that peanut butter contains trans fats, which is actually not true. So peanut butter does not contain partially hydrogenated vegetable oils or trans fats. Manufacturers may add a little bit of palm oil, or there may be other types of saturated fat that they may put. But again, it's a very small amount. Now, I will say, if that's something that you may be concerned about for whatever health reasons you have, there are all these other options on the supermarket shelves, right? There are others that you can get that are no stir. You don't necessarily have to stir it. Or those that you do have to stir, where the fat kind of rises on top. If you prefer those, that's totally fine. But again, with the peanut butter, 90% peanuts. So in the research, we don't see much of a difference in terms of the benefits. So the studies that I was talking about earlier, it wasn't as if those studies said, okay, well, let's use peanut butter that's 100% peanuts. In fact, the one from Texas, the randomized control trial that I talked about from Texas, that one was just regular peanut butter. And we saw the same effects there. again, I think that's kind of where it comes down to personal choice, but we don't really see the differences in the research.
Interesting. And because, again, it's protein, it's the healthy fat, even if it has a little bit of sugar, like you said, with the adding the peanut butter to the high glycemic breakfast actually improved the blood sugar response. So that's exciting.
There's another concept too when it comes on to healthy eating. I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues about this. And, here in this country, sometimes we think of healthy as being tasteless, right? And so when you think about getting folks to eat more fruits and vegetables, that's a challenge in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Fruits, vegetables, legumes. Honestly, we don't really see much of an issue with that with peanut butter in terms of getting folks to eat it because it is a popular food. But again, just adding a small amount of sugar or a small amount of salt in order to increase the palatability there of a product, as long as it doesn't necessarily adversely affect health, that's a great way to sort of get your fruits, vegetables, or peanut butter in. In fact, there was a study done in children, and this was from Baylor University some years ago. And what they found was that just including peanut butter helped children eat more fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
So having that celery, dipping it in peanut butter, or apples, dipping it in peanut butter. So that to me is a win-win because you can get folks to eat healthier by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or spreading it on a whole grain slice of bread and yeah.
Right.
Well, since we're talking about some ways to enjoy peanut butter, and it's just so funny, like you said, I think we already enjoy it. So now if we can just think of it as a health food instead of an indulgent food, or maybe, like I always like to say, enjoy your food with health in mind. But when we're thinking about, like you said, have a little bit of salt or sugar added, it's no different than having a nice bowl of steaming hot oatmeal where you add a little bit of brown sugar, or you have a lovely green salad with a little bit of salad dressing.
Right.
I love these ways to combine foods so that you're getting more produce, as you mentioned. We're not getting enough fruits and vegetables, and it's a great vehicle to try to get more of those in our diet. But as we're talking about some of these practical tips, for me, I just like put peanut butter on whatever. You can make a smoothie with it, but you probably have some interesting tips that our listeners might want to try with peanuts and peanut butter.
So one of the things that I was introduced to when I moved to Georgia was boiled peanuts.
Yep.
And that was, I had never tried boiled peanuts before. And when I tried it, I realized that boiled peanuts really help to kind of define peanuts as both a legume and a nut, because when it's boiled, it tastes more like a bean. And when it's roasted, it's more like a nut. And so I like to use boiled peanuts like on salads.
And those, for people who don't know, come in a can, right?
Yes, they can either come in a can or in a jar, or here in the rural South, you might have some manufacturers kind of vacuum seal a plastic bag and just have like the boiled peanut in shells, and you can buy it that way.
So you're not boiling them at home.
No.
Right.
Although a lot of folks here do boil them at home.
I bet.
You boil them when they are first picked, when they're green. But yes, I've never done it. I haven't yet done it, but I'm sure I will. So that's one of the ways that I like to enjoy peanuts now. And I also like to do a lot of Oriental sauces. So peanut soy sauces. I like to do that. As well as, because I am plant-based, I also like to incorporate it into some meatless recipes. One of those recipes, I think we put that on our website, is an eggplant parm hoagie sandwich. With the eggplant, one of the reasons I wanted to do this was because eggplant in and of itself is not necessarily like a great protein source. I mean, it has a little bit, but it's not necessarily high in protein. So what I did was I coated that eggplant with breadcrumbs as well as peanut powder. And the peanut powder is pretty high in protein, so it increases the protein content of that meal. And it actually ends up with a nice nutty flavor, but not overpowering, as well as sort of crispy on the outside, nice and juicy on the inside. And I kind of do that as a hoagie. You could do that as a hoagie or with some pasta and a salad on the side. So I like to be creative and do some out-the-box recipes with peanuts and peanut butter.
Interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned the powdered peanut butter. I'm sure there's been research on that as well. But for people who may not be familiar with powdered peanuts, right? I'm thinking of a product as like PB2 or something. Can you explain to people what that is?
So powdered peanuts or powdered peanut butter, both terms are actually right, is a product where you basically ground the peanuts and then some of the fat is removed. Now, not necessarily because the fats are bad, but it's what kind of helps to give it that powdery shape. So it's especially useful for fitness settings. So, for example, if you want to use that in your shake, or if you are an athlete where you would like to improve your protein intake, 2 tablespoons of that powdered peanut butter. I forget how much protein that is, but it's a significant amount of protein, probably about 20 grams of protein, and it depends on the manufacturer as well. So you actually get a good amount of that protein there. It's also a good way to introduce peanuts early to young children. And I think Sherry may have talked about this a little bit, but you can sort of mix that peanut powder in water or breast milk or yogurt, and that way it can be introduced to your child. So it's a really sort of versatile way and just another form to get peanuts and peanut butter in.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I hadn't thought to ask about that. So we've talked a little bit about plant-based eating, and that trend is growing. Is there anything else that you wanted to share regarding peanut products and plant-based eating trend?
Yeah, well, I think that when it comes on to the plant-based eating trend, and I'll just say a plant-based diet is really just one that emphasizes foods that are derived from plants. So it's not an exclusive diet where a person has to be exclusively plant-based to consider themselves plant-based. No, the focus is on what a person emphasizes rather than what they're avoiding. So although there is no formal definition, generally speaking, sometimes that may translate to a vegetarian diet. For some people, it may be mostly vegetarian or Mediterranean diet or mind diet, etc. There are different forms of that. And I think that we all can relate to that, plant-based eating. One of the things that I would say, as someone who's been fully plant-based for about 13 years now, is that I have been concerned that there's some trends that we're having where the protein in the meal is not necessarily adequate. So there's some foods that are great, and you can. I'll just mention one trend. So I've never tried this, but there's like the seared watermelon where you're supposed to use that and it looks like sushi or steak. I've never actually tried it. But, sometimes when I look at trends like that, I think, we do have to be careful that we are, making sure we're emphasizing plant-based proteins within that space. And that's where peanuts and peanut butter really kind of fit in because, again, they're a really good source of protein. And so because of the versatility there, you can really kind of add it to different meals. So let's say, for example, you do want to do a watermelon steak, if that is your thing. If that is your thing, you want to do a watermelon steak, just making sure that, okay, you may have a salad on the side and you may use peanuts and peanut butter as, your source of protein within that meal. And just making sure that that's adequate throughout the day. So I think that's really where peanuts and peanut butter shine.
That's a great point. As a certified diabetes educator, I often think, okay, getting more plants in our diet is great, but a lot of the plant products aren't rich in protein, like you said. And then we start seeing the diet shift more towards a vegetarian diet where we do need to be cognizant of getting adequate protein. And especially with people with diabetes, it's harder to manage their blood sugars when their protein intake is low and they're getting all these carbohydrates. So I like that balanced approach better. And the plant-based proteins like peanuts can really be a good solution for that. I think I saw a little bit of research, and this is not the focus of our discussion today, but if you wanted to share some information about the research that you're seeing with regard to peanut products and cognition or mental health. We talk about this on the podcast quite a bit, so I'd love to hear any insights.
Sure. And when it comes on to cognition, when you think about, let's say, for example, Alzheimer's disease, there's a trending term, type 3 diabetes, not necessarily set in stone just yet, but some folks are kind of looking at whether or not there's a connection between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. So we may not necessarily be too far off there. But there was a study that was just released last month, actually, in the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease. And this one analyzed NHANES data. So it was a cross-sectional study. So there are limitations there in terms of application. But it did look at over 3,000 older individuals. And the study found that people who did not consume peanuts or peanut butter regularly had up to 71% increased chance of scoring poorly on cognitive tests than those who did. Now, of course, that one was a cross-sectional study, but it coincided quite well with another study out of Australia in 2017 that showed improvements in short-term memory, verbal fluency, processing speed when consuming peanuts. Now, in terms of the mechanisms, we're not necessarily quite sure yet what we're seeing and why. It is an emerging area of research, but we do think that part of what we're seeing has to do with increased blood flow to the brain when eating peanuts. And I talked about this with cardiovascular disease and the endothelial function. And so we think that that has a lot to do with it, some of the nutrients and polyphenols and antioxidants that are in peanuts. So we also know, for example, that peanuts are a great source of, an excellent source actually, of niacin and a good source of vitamin E. And both of these nutrients have been independently shown in studies to reduce Alzheimer's disease risk by 70%. We also know that peanuts contain resveratrol, which is an antioxidant, and that also improves blood flow and also has antioxidant capacities. But there's another compound that we're starting to see may have some functionality when it comes on to brain health, and specifically when it comes on to mental health, and that compound is called p-cumaric acid. It's a polyphenol, an antioxidant, and there have been a few studies over the last few years that have shown that mechanistically, p-cumaric acid seems to be able to target GABA in the brain to regulate mood and anxiety. And this was actually from a 2014 study that actually showed that it was able to target that transmitter and subsequently decrease anxiety and stress. Of course, it was a mechanistic study, and so there's more that needs to be done there. But we're thinking that that might be what we're seeing in the research, but there's definitely more to come there. It's in its early stages.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And as you said, the kind of relationship there with the blood flow, we like to talk about, what's good for the heart is good for the brain, but really interesting insights. Thank you. I always like to talk about farming whenever possible on the podcast. And since this episode is sponsored by the Georgia Peanut Commission, I want to give a shout out to the Georgia peanut farmers and growers. Let's just kind of go over some basic farming facts when it comes to peanuts. What would you like to share with the listeners?
So one of the things that our listeners may not know is that peanuts are actually Georgia's top crop. I know that, we usually tend to think of Georgia. Peach is definitely high up there. We love peaches as well. But peanuts are really Georgia's top crop. So in 2020, Georgia peanut farmers produced 53% of all peanuts grown in the United States. That's 1.64 million tons and a $2 billion industry. And the main type of peanuts that's grown in Georgia is the runner type peanut. And this is what is predominantly used for peanut butter production. Another thing that our listeners may not know is that peanuts really excel when it comes on to sustainability. And one of the reasons is that peanuts tend to use less water than comparable sources of nutrition. So, for example, to grow 1 ounce of peanuts, it takes 4.7 gallons of water compared to maybe 80 gallons of water for an ounce of some similar crops. Peanuts are also nitrogen fixing. And what that means is that they replenish the soil with essential nitrogen that's depleting from other crops. And so this means that less fertilizer is needed to grow peanuts, and it is also used as a rotational crop. And this ultimately leads to less greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also a really cool point. Another point is that peanuts are a zero waste plant. So literally every part of the peanut, from the roots to the hulls, is really utilized. So the hulls are used for animal feed and fuel. And then the hay, that's used for livestock feeding. We've got biodiesel that's produced from peanut oil. And then I don't think I touched on peanut skins much, but there's emerging uses that are being discovered for peanut skins because we're finding that these skins contain high levels of antioxidants and polyphenols as well. So it may even, I actually saw a study maybe about a month ago that looked at the potential of peanut skins to be used in lotions for anti-wrinkling effects. And so that's something that's pretty early, but I'll just say emerging uses are being discovered for that as well. So really all parts of the peanuts are used.
Oh, it's very interesting. And I especially love the nitrogen fixing. It's good for the soil and the sustainability aspects that you shared. Thank you. We talked about some practical tips and you shared some really interesting culinary suggestions, but I know that there's recipes and other meal solution type tips online. So I would love to hear where people can go for more information. I will put links in my show notes as well, and also include some more agriculture information if anybody's interested in that. But where can people find more about peanut health and research information online?
There are lots of resources, and two that I'll mention. You can find nutritional information, educational resources, and recipes from www.peanutinstitute.com. And you can also go to www.gapeanuts.com as well for some additional resources. I'll also mention that, we've talked a bit about diabetes on this segment, and there's a research library on the Peanut Institute website that literally takes you through. You can search all the research that's been published on peanuts in specific areas, such as diabetes, and get a summary for that, as well as a link to the actual study. And then we also have videos. They're called our Science Made Simple series. So what it does is it takes you through the body in animated form and shows how the nutrients in peanuts can help to protect our bodies against disease as well as promote overall health and wellness. And again, on the Georgia Peanuts website, gapeanuts.com, there are also a lot of educational resources having to do with farming and production, as well as recipes and tips too. So check those out.
Excellent. I didn't know about those videos. I got to check those out for sure. And I do encourage everybody to go to those websites and to follow Peanuts on social media. I'll include all the links in my show notes. But thank you so much, Samara. It has been so fun talking with you and learning from you today.
Yeah, it's been great being here. Thanks again for having me.
My pleasure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.